Smoking is a habit that's very harmful to health. That's something everyone knows. That's why cigarette pack manufacturers are required to display warnings with images showing the effects of smoking on the human body. But even though it's common knowledge that smoking can cause many types of diseases, a lot of people still end up smoking and suffering the consequences. But what few people know is that there are robots that smoke too. Our lungs have small structures called alveoli, which work like little air sacs and allow for gas exchange while we breathe. These alveoli expand as they fill with air and are richly supplied with blood vessels. The walls of these blood vessels form a kind of boundary. On one side, you find lung cells, and on the other, the cells of the blood vessel wall. And recently, scientists managed to replicate this configuration of human cells on a chip similar to a computer chip. But instead of channeling electrons, these chips channel cells, including immune system cells. And what's most amazing is that these cells can simulate the functioning of a lung for several weeks, all outside the human body. That's impressive. But what's the purpose of having a chip that mimics a human lung? Before this innovation, it was much harder to accurately simulate how a human organ functions. And as a result, it was very complicated to understand how certain diseases affect these organs. That's because to study diseases, you need to run tests and make comparisons, but these comparisons aren't always translatable to our reality. Many times comparisons are made between large groups, for example, people who smoke versus those who don't, but that doesn't take into account each individual's specific characteristics. For example, each person may have different habits or genetic conditions, which can create a lot of noise when interpreting the data. Because within the same group of people classified simply as smokers, you could have someone who is a smoker and sedentary, and another who smokes but exercises daily. And beyond these individual differences, there's the issue that when researchers test directly on airway cell samples, it's not possible to replicate the breathing patterns of the lungs, which can end up influencing the results of the research. One thing is a cell being in the lung, exposed to air, another is being isolated on a petri dish without those conditions. Another alternative would be to conduct more standardized tests on animals, which could yield better comparisons between groups. But besides the ethical issues and even the time involved in those cases, it's not always possible to compare animal results to what actually happens in humans. That's because they're simply different species. For example, when using data collected from animals like mice to better understand how the lungs are affected by smoking, we have to consider some key differences between humans and rodents. Mice only breathe through their noses, and passively. Humans, on the other hand, when smoking, breathe actively through their mouths, so the exposure to smoke isn't exactly the same. Not to mention that the immune responses of mice are different from those of humans. And when testing directly on humans, certain types of tests simply can't be done because they're too dangerous for our health. There's also the minor issue that it's impossible to test, in the same individual, how their immune response would be both after being exposed to cigarette smoke and not being exposed. You can't do both at the same time. So because of these variations, until now it hadn't been possible to precisely identify how smoking affects our lungs under normal breathing conditions. However, with the use of lung chips, it's possible to simulate 2, 3, 10, or more environments with identical cells from the same human being. In other words, it's possible to make much better comparisons because the genetic conditions are the same and there's no influence from habits outside those controlled by the research. In chip-based experiments, habits can be controlled. For example, some chips can be exposed to cigarette smoke while others are not, and every other parameter, genetics and habits, is the same. And the only thing that changes between these is the smoke exposure factor. Beyond that standardization, it's possible to simulate the real dynamics of an alveolus expanding with each breath. These chips, which are flexible, receive airflow from a robot that inhales and exhales in a pattern that mimics human breathing. This machine can act like a human mouth, inhaling cigarette smoke and then exhaling while also breathing normal air between puffs. In this way, this method becomes much more accurate than other experiments used in the past. So in the group of chips that receive the smoke, all the robot needs is a good supply of cigarettes and a lighter. And just like that, voila! We have a smoking robot capable of chain smoking an absurd number of cigarettes. It's literally a smoke machine. And this molecular level observation of the human lung tissue inside each chip allows us to study how immune defense cells behave during an inflammatory process. Scientists who developed these chips found that in those exposed to smoke, there was a kind of cellular mutation where structures called cilia started moving much slower than those found in healthy lungs, of people and robots who don't smoke. And if it's already possible to emulate a human lung,
It's also possible that one day other organs and other diseases could be studied by scientists, helping uncover more mysteries about how the human body works. This opens a wide range of possibilities for how scientific studies on human organs could be conducted in the future. With these small chips, research can be much more standardized and the results far more realistic and useful to science, all without putting animals or human lives at risk. The hope then is that studies using these devices will help scientists develop medications for diseases that currently have no cure, and that in the future, they'll be able to create individualized and personalized treatments according to each patient's needs and characteristics. That's why today we have robots that smoke so much. This fascinating technological advance has allowed humanity to better understand the effects of smoking on the body, and it's just the first step in the pursuit of knowledge about other conditions and diseases. This knowledge may help guide us in developing treatments for those illnesses so that one day people suffering from them can live longer with more quality of life in a world that's a little better for them and for us all.